Hi, this is John with Wisdom for the Church. Thank you for tuning into the channel. If you haven't already, go ahead and subscribe and drop a like on this video. It only takes 1 second and it makes a massive difference. And as always, thank you for watching. All right, well, welcome back to Wisdom for the Church. I am John. We'll get back into it. This video is a returning guest, and he is the first guest, I think, to be on this wonderful channel 3 times, which means we don't scare him away or whatever.
Yeah, let's go.
Jeff, how you doing, man?
I'm doing well. Thanks for having me on. I'm always honored when you ask, but that's a feather in my cap, man. Three times. Let's go.
Yeah. Other than me, I've been on more than 3 times, and
sure,
I don't count myself.
I'll happily take second place to that. That's a good place to be.
Yeah, no, of course. And if some of us caught other videos that you've been on with me, they've at least seen you and heard some what you have to say. But if they haven't, where are you located? What do you do?
Yeah, I'm in Middle Tennessee. Husband, father, pastor. Teach a little bit at a private school and do some farming. Nothing too radical. What I always say is it suits me just fine. So very thankful for the stuff I'm able to do.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm guessing where you are has not had any sort of impact, like by the hurricane or anything. I'm not sure.
No, other than we were in that drought, and what was left of the hurricane came and gave us some much needed rain. It's kind of an odd position to be in as a guy who does some farming, to be like, please Lord, send rain, knowing it's coming at the cost of people losing everything. It's bizarre, but that's the only thing it touched. I went up to North Carolina earlier this week to see some of those folks, and man, they're in a tough spot.
Okay. Yeah. Well, I'm sure you've seen some rough sights then, for sure. So houses, I've heard stories or seen videos. Look, a house is floating by. Yeah. Total areas devastated. I don't know how much to believe one way or the other, but I've heard there's been a lot of, in some areas at least, looting and just areas devastated without much help coming.
Yeah, I mean, it's you wonder sometimes if like social media gives you an accurate picture, but what I saw firsthand was absolutely what I saw on Twitter. The hurricanes are not supposed to hit the hollers, and the amount of water that it dumped just destroyed everything. My area a couple of years ago had some pretty catastrophic tornadoes hit. Houses turned into matchsticks. It looked like a giant rat's nest.
Oh.
Well, that's what it looked like up there on in a holler that has one road in, and big sheets of asphalt laid to the side of the road, people trying to restore access. I mean, it's unreal how I'm assuming it's going to be years before their way of life is even feasible again, just because of how remote the areas are. It's brutal.
Yeah. Well, continue to be in prayer. I've heard, I think Georgia, North Carolina, West Virginia, parts of Tennessee, parts of Kentucky. Maybe I'm missing, Florida, obviously.
Sure, Florida just got hit again, yeah.
But I may be missing 1 or 2 places, but a lot of places, a lot of states. So
yeah, that's the list in my mind, but who knows? That was a huge hurricane, Helene or whatever, and I'm sure it touched a lot of places.
Yeah. Well, yeah. We will transition in. So you've been on twice, and today's idea is going to be about living hospitably or living with some generosity. But before that, Jeff, our video was fun last time. I wanted to read some kind comments that we got. Because they always are, on my channel, they're always the nicest comments.
Okay.
All right. So we talked about last time, I think I titled it Bizzaro World, basically a Christian strategy for living in times that in many ways seem upside down. And I think a lot of what we talked about was live local, start small, start with your local church, care for those around you. Don't neglect global, don't neglect regional, obviously, but know that you are limited. And so start basically where God has you. We're local creatures first.
Sure.
Basically, that's a lot of what we talked about. And I'll read a couple comments from one of them. Just a thought, but instead of building a community based on unproven belief, why don't you focus on science literacy a bit more? Just a opinion. Parentheses, being that most highly educated people let go of silly belief structures once they get educated understanding of our world, in parentheses, assuming you care about what's actually true, but then a smiley face with like the rosy cheeks. So,
well, that makes it all better.
yeah.
There
That
is no
comment was
ignorant
and great
condescension
comments.
like a materialist, man. They live in this isolated intellectual bubble, disconnected from most humans throughout all of history, and that's the tone they take, man. Reddit exists for people like that. I hope they I hope their feedback loop is rich.
Yeah, that was I think we went back and forth a bit, but I mean that was I was like, well, like I think science and the ability to think rationally actually have a foundation in a God who is orderly and has given us the ability to understand His world.
Yeah, and
So
the
amen to
materialist
science.
believes. Yeah, the materialist believes in spontaneous generation. He still believes that flies arise spontaneously from poop, and we're the anti-intellectuals. Good job, man. Good job.
That's the Jeff Wright commentary on that comment. I'll read one
That's so
more.
funny, man.
This
Those
one,
people exist and move among us.
I mean, it's honestly it's like 4-1 in terms of the comments. This one was kind of a lot actually, but I'm already into it. Help communities, but please keep your religion to yourself. We don't care what your holy book says. We don't want to hear about the creepy blood sacrifice of your evil deity for forgiveness. I require no forgiveness, only to be better than I was yesterday, or about the toxic message of quote unquote love me and believe in me or else. This is what abusive partners and parents sound like, or your weird obsession with intimacy. We'll say that intimate acts. I guess we talked about like somewhere in there. Behind closed doors, actions speaking to your beliefs in a welcoming environment for all religions. Even if I am an atheist, I am not here to argue, just to spread the good word of what it means to live in a secular society. Have a great day. I wish you success in your lives and happiness in your families and perhaps a little critical thinking no matter who reads this. And so I just commented back, thank you for expressing your religion and not keeping it to yourself.
Yeah, man. I mean, the hypocrisy radiates off of that, and apparently they're completely oblivious.
Yeah.
You just wonder how someone becomes so self unaware that they
Yeah.
would write something like that. That's unreal, man.
Yeah. I
How
think,
funny.
we're all growing in the discipline of all of us thinking and trying to apply the truth in the public sphere or in our lives or wherever. And so we're all growing in that. But once you come to an understanding or just a light bulb, maybe that there is no neutrality, that unlocks a lot because then everyone who comes out with saying anything is imposing a position onto others. The only variables are going to be like how far are you pushing it, what type of morality are you pushing, but even the secularist does believe in laws for XYZ and are therefore in their own way imposing it like their religion on you,
Yeah.
right?
It's inherent to a truth claim. You can't make a truth claim without being exclusionary. And, if you want to make the truth claim that life spontaneously arises from non-life, contrary to all empirical evidence, you want to hang on to Darwin when even the establishment Darwinians are moving on to neo-Darwinianism because they know it's bunk. Man, more power to you, but you're making a truth claim. And, that point about love me or else, Jesus Christ is Lord, and He does not change
Yeah.
His opinion on that just because you can't cope with it. So, like I said, best of luck with your life. I would just say best of luck with your afterlife, and I really do hope that you'll leave your foolishness behind before it's too late, because Jesus is good at being Lord, and He protects His dignity first, thankfully, by offering us salvation in His name. But if you want to persist in rebellion against that, that's a long-term bad play.
Yeah. Yep. And you took it to, the serious, what's it going to be in the end, in the final judgment. In all seriousness, as much fun as I have with some of those comments, in a weird way, I actually do enjoy, like not in a sick way, but like I do enjoy when people bring pushback, even if they're, a little bit, what I would say, nasty. It's just like, well, you actually took the time to watch this and comment.
Sure.
As weird as that is, I really do appreciate that.
And they're acknowledging that these things are of first importance. Whatever coping mechanisms they're needing to express in those comments, they nonetheless realize what the stakes are. And I just hope they realize that YouTube comments aren't going to stand up. In the end, their conscience tells them that there will be a judgment. Yeah. And you can plug your ears and scream into the bucket as long as you want, but it's still coming. So, the next step would be, well, since this is of ultimate importance, what's the best, even if you're thinking about just pure self-interest, what's the best way to deal with that? Because clearly, raging about a God that you claim to not exist. I've never posted a rage against the flying spaghetti monster. You're telling us that you know better. Man, don't keep doing the foolish stuff. Realize you're eating at a pig trough and turn to Christ. He's there. He's there one way or the other. And you can do it in a way that your life is preserved.
Yeah. Amen, man. Well, yeah, I need you preaching in the comment section. That was helpful.
I don't know, man. I spend a lot of time laughing at that stuff. It just tickles my funny bone when I read that stuff. I mean, for the reasons you highlighted, like, man, have you ever had a self-critical thought? You believe in debunked science from like the Victorian era. I don't know, man. Not a good look for the guy taking the condescending position.
Yeah, it's interesting times, ability to go back and forth like really quick these days. So leads to some fun things at times.
Sure.
Okay, so Bizzaro World 2. This time talking about a little bit of a different subject, but still connected, I think, to last time, just Christian strategy for life in our time. So we will look at basically being hospitable to those in your locale, not to mention just general ideas of charitable giving, perhaps giving to the poor. And so here is my opening thoughts, and I thought we could just jump off here. Your thoughts here. We're talking about socially, economically, politically, when it comes to acts of mercy, caring for our fellow man, etc. It seems like that the socially or economically liberals of our day in general, those get more credit, perhaps more branding as being the generous ones, the compassionate ones, the helpful ones. And so my first question is two questions. Number one, is it fair to say that statement is true, that there's better or more belief for branding that is the case if we just go a little bit too simplified, but let's just say Republican, Democrat? And if that's fair to say, would you agree with it to be true? Why or why not?
Yeah, just to make sure I'm clear on this. So the idea that we're inquiring about is whether or not people on the left, either theologically, politically, or both, are more generous than those on the right.
Correct. Yeah, because it seems to me, at least, that is what is the overall sentiment or belief in terms of why to go for that party, for example.
Yeah. So based on the empirical evidence, polling, the kind of data we have available to us, liberals aren't even in the same zip code, maybe not the same cosmos in terms of giving that conservatives are. This is widely available. Thinking about getting ready for this podcast, I just went back and double checked it. I've got stuff in sermon notes and whatnot where I've cited this, but I wanted to go get it fresh. What was interesting to me is my search engine returned these coping mechanism articles for like NPR had one that stands out that says conservatives give more, but there's more to the story here. And you start scrolling down through it and they're like, well, we don't really know where they're giving. We don't really know what they're doing with it. It could be that they're all self-serving in their donations. I'm like, okay, so the data is so clear. You have to turn to an argument from silence to say, we're just going to suspect that somehow they're doing this the wrong way, to try to cope with the idea that this narrative we've given ourselves as the left is completely unfindable in the objective data.
Yeah.
And it actually makes sense, because people are always going to live in the framework that they've adopted as best they can. Now, we talked earlier, some people are going to use coping mechanisms to hold off what they know about God. And I don't deny that there are generous people on the left.
Of course.
They're made in the image of God, and God himself is generous, and that bubbles to the surface. So they exist. But statistically, they're infinitely in the minority compared to religious people, religious conservatives in particular. Well, why is that? Their big story that they're living in says that the weak need to be replaced by the strong. There's no incentive in a Darwinian framework to do the lifting up of a fellow man the way there is in Christianity, where our God stooped to lift us up. And so they're it's an easy paradigm to see the distinction in. They believe the weak are basically to be replaced by the strong for the progress of humanity. We believe the strongest became weak to care for humanity, and that's playing out in the way we make decisions about what we do with disposable income, and sometimes not even disposable income. We have the commendable story of the widow giving her last mite to the work of the Lord. And I mentioned I went up to North Carolina, went up through Johnson City, and man, churches up there are killing it. They are doing incredible work, and except for one church, there was one church up on a pretty high hill, and they didn't get mud flooded or rain damage and things like that, water damage, and so they were like the host for the disaster relief teams and whatnot. Every other church I saw, and there were a ton of little country churches where I was riding around, two things were happening. Church members were shoveling their churches out, and they were handing out water, diapers, dog food. I mean, it's not even just charity to image bearers. They're making sure that people's pets were taken care of, and they're doing it at the same time. Well, we have a theology of that. We're imperfect replicants of that theology, but we know that we're supposed to serve because Christ served. And so, the narrative is paper thin. As soon as you scratch it, it just falls apart.
Yeah. Yeah. I know of, speaking of people going to North Carolina, I know of some people in my area that are devout members of their local church. And the comment that I heard was like, a few guys were going to North Carolina and they were going to bring guns, bourbon, and chainsaws. That's what they're so they're going to clear stuff out. They were bringing supplies and stuff too. But
I'm not much for vision casting, but that's a pretty good vision to cast.
You got 10 guys in like 2 seconds. It was unbelievable.
Yeah. Well, I mean, we heard stories about that too. We were up in an area where local equipment owners had cleared the road to get up to this church and get up to the people behind them. And when we got to that church, the guy said, "Look, there were like 30 people from a church in Boone. I don't know how they got here. They must have climbed over the mountain, and they showed up and just started chipping in and helping us get stuff set up where we could give away donations that were making their way and whatnot." It's unreal, man. There's kind of a godly aggression in being helpful to people that's baked into Christianity that basically no other worldview can boast.
Yeah. We talked a bit, I guess, offline about just maybe the ethic of the New Testament, but the book that came to mind was First Thessalonians. Like we talked about pastoring, and though this is not specifically about disaster relief or something in that book, it shows that Paul is ready to labor with the people, be involved in their lives, and there is a hospitality, there is a generosity in that, because you are being sacrificial with your time, your talents, your physical ability, all those sorts of things.
Well, yeah, when you get into Paul's letter, his theology of generosity involves productivity, right? He says, let a man work with his hands so that he will have something to share with those who are in need. And so it's just baked into the moral framework of the Christian New Testament ethic that we're productive, and we're productive with an eye towards how do I help those who are in worse circumstances. You can't get away from it.
Yeah. Yeah. It is incredible, especially those. We're talking in generalities, of course, in this video, as you've mentioned, which we'll get to. But, when it comes to a church context, it's so interesting, specifically those who excel in works of hospitality. It's spiritual. It's a spiritual gift. It is like a superpower. And we all grow in it and need to grow in it, but particularly those who are more prone and more gifted in that area, specifically of just having an eye for helping others and like caring for their needs. It is incredible and shines when times of need arise. Those who will always have a door open to have someone in their house that they need a place to stay, those who somehow can cook a casserole like this, the guy who always has his truck ready to help you move or whatever it is. Like you see that happen so quickly when you're just even trying to attend a church, that it's really encouraging. Shows the work of the Lord.
Well, and the ecclesiology of the New Testament tells us that those who are gifted in that way aren't like the special forces of the church on this front, but because we're part of one body, they model and encourage and define ways that people who aren't similarly gifted can pitch in too. I mean, it's such a robust ethical system, which is unsurprising if you understand that you're living according to the Creator's design.
Yeah.
But it's the kind of thing that that draws people in. It draws people in, even sometimes against kind of their personality,
Mm-hmm.
and reshapes them so that it's increasingly part of who they are as a human being. You talk about seeing the Lord's glory in the way that He uses the church to shape the church to be a positive force in the world in which He's dropped them. It's incalculable how generous He's been to the world through the church.
Yeah. It is one kind of final, I guess, thought on that is if you're just an average Joe that goes to a church, and we're of course talking about a church context just because we're two Christians talking, it's going to happen.
Yeah.
But you go to church context and you meet someone or a group of people that help you or like provide something for you, and they have no agenda behind it.
Right.
That is powerful. It's weird, in terms of the world's standards, how things actually play out. If it's one of the first times you experience something like that, you're taken aback. You're like, wait a second, what's the catch? It's like, no, we love you.
Yes, and I guess I would acknowledge, based on your comments there earlier from the previous video, there are people who will watch this who'll go, but wait a minute, I know Kenneth Copeland exists. I know Joel Osteen exists. I know Creflo Dollar exists. You're right, they do. And they attach themselves parasitically to the church. But you have to understand, your criticisms of those people are not nearly as sharp as our criticisms of them. We understand the way that they distort and pervert the message of Jesus Christ. You're not one bit more interested in driving them from the public sphere than authentic Christians are. We know how vicious and how perverse what they're doing is.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. It's a good word. So I've mentioned the kind of larger concepts, acts of mercy. We're called all throughout Scripture to care for the poor. It's repeated in the New Testament. Jesus, Paul, you name it, you see it all over the place. We see concepts in the Old Testament, probably in the New too, but the Old Testament comes to mind of there has to be a justice system that acknowledges that, certain people are probably going to be taken advantage of due to them not having the means to fight back, oftentimes widows, orphans, and the poor, those who have fewer means to fight back, basically. When it comes to like giving and charity, is there something to be said about, in general, conservatives and more liberals having different philosophies of what that means? And if so, how have you seen that, Jeff?
Yeah, I think I can illustrate that just with efficiency models. And so the way that I would contrast those two parties, or that carries political connotations, those two groups.
Yeah.
is on the model by which goods are supposed to be distributed to those who are in need. So the Christian model is charity. I do without in order to provide for someone else. And charity is almost always direct. I know the person, I'm supporting the person, right? You go to the left, and their idea is central bureaucracy. And every human being, even those who hate Christianity, we know that bureaucracy is the most inefficient way to do basically anything.
Yeah.
And so I realize that charitable giving has limitations. I realize that even charities require certain, bureaucratic structures, administrative structures. But the thing I've tried to kind of meet someone on a common grace level and say, is it more efficient to distribute resources? Let's say we have $100 and we want it to go to someone in need. I can take that $100 to a person that I know and give it to them. And I can, on the backside of that, offer some accountability. Oh, we gave you the $100. You ended up buying, a carton of cigarettes. There's going to be consequences for that in the future, right? Or do we take the $100, give it to a professional whose salary has to be funded from somewhere, and then distribute those resources, right? And so if you can get this kind of concept at an empirical level, there's going to be resources diverted to maintaining the bureaucracy that are not diverted when you are involved in direct charitable giving. So one of the, not to make everything about the hurricane, but it's just such a ready illustration of this. I was listening to the most updated data I could find, and the federal government, FEMA, has distributed at the time we're recording this, I think $4 million to help those affected by Hurricane Helene. Well, if you dig into the numbers, they have spent $200 million on Helene relief. So $4 million distributed to the victims, 200 spent. Where did the 200 number, the difference between 200 and 4, where did it go? It went to the bureaucracy. It's providing people who are on salary to go to the area, their hotels, comping their meals while they're there. And so you just move this giant bureaucratic apparatus into an area that's already in need of housing.
Yeah.
You divert a tremendous amount of money to support the bureaucracy, and very little of it actually ends up with the people who are in actual need. Now, we took, for instance, bottles of water. I watched the bottles of water that we took be handed to people who were driving it back to their house or to their neighbor's house to give them drinking water because their wells were out of commission. There are issues of scale. I want to grant that. But the central bureaucratic model inherently dilutes and disperses the impact of what is given. Another example, there's a guy who I follow on social media who was, going with helicopter pilots and four-wheel drive folks, people on side-by-sides and whatnot, pulling people out of the mud, getting them cleaned up, and then trying to get them into a hotel because up in the mountains, it's already getting down to like 40 at night. And so you think about people who are literally in the mud, they're cold, we got to get them somewhere. One of the hotels in the area that was functioning still had power that he went to, turned him away and said, we are entirely booked by federal employees. There's no housing. There's no room in the inn for the people who actually just lived through a mudslide because the bureaucrats need the rooms. Once again, no comparison of the real world impact of charitable giving versus wealth redistribution through government mechanisms.
Yeah.
And if you can get somebody to dial down their animosity towards Christ and the church long enough to just think about practicalities, they'll see this. That one other thing, I don't mean to monologue on this too much, but
you're fine.
The other advantage we have is accountability. So you think about how many watchdog groups are out there with their eye on charitable organizations and expect regular filings, disclosure of financial amounts, right? And then when they find error, publish it broadly, and the donor base dries up. You have nothing comparable to that with the federal government. We know they're tremendously inefficient in the distribution of their resources. We can document that 1,000 different ways. there's no mechanism of accountability because they're going to get their income tax, from people, and they're going to run the money printer at the Fed, however much they want, regardless of what the consequences are. So even in the private sector of charitable donations, where there exists a bureaucracy, it has meaningful accountability. Nothing like that exists in the government sector.
Yeah. Those are helpful. So, you mentioned kind of two ways, if you will, and a lot of what you mentioned were pragmatics. What's practical? Look at these two ways of viewing things. You mentioned, the Christian model, we'll say, is more direct charity. And then you mentioned more on the left side, central bureaucracy. And one of those has far more, direct impact, probably far less unneeded cost, more accountability. And then you've got, overall, one thing you think about bureaucracy, you just think about something inefficient, big, and bloated, and a lot of red tape and frustrating, even if motives are good. And obviously, the government, it's not like all things the government ever does is bad, or they've done nothing when it comes to Helen and stuff. I don't think you're saying that, but you're just saying general trends of these two ways better practically, correct?
Yeah, again, I'll go back to the mountain. So what I found there is that FEMA was doing a very bad job at best, often in the way of people who were trying to make things happen. I talked to some local equipment owners. They were rebuilding a road so that resources could move up. FEMA tried to stop them, told them if they didn't stop, they would fine them later for clearing this road. FEMA is not around clearing roads. They're just telling you you'll get fined later. The Red Cross was also seen as mostly in the way. Not in the malicious way that FEMA was, but just kind of bumbling. The group that I heard multiple people praise was Samaritan's Purse. They said the Samaritan's Purse people are here. They're doing a good job. They're not getting their way. They're being helpful. They're pitching in where we need them rather than where they want it. If it's not always where we want them to help, but they'll just jump in and like carry stuff out of the way so people can get through and whatnot. Here again, I mean, do what you want with the data. You've also got the eyewitness testimony of what people who are suffering are saying about who's actually being helpful. And in their minds, it's the people most connected to like grassroots charity, not the people most connected to government bureaucracy.
Yep. So a lot of those, and that's helpful, was a view pragmatically. Efficiency, direct help, accountability versus in general bureaucracy. As a Christian, we'll ask you this, and I know you well enough to know that you identify as socially, politically conservative as well. You would argue by virtue of your Christianity and what the Bible teaches. Sure. What is sort of the moral difference? Like, is there a moral difference of why you don't view the left as a good way of viewing charity? Let me know if that question makes sense.
Yeah, it's I wouldn't frame my conclusions based around rejecting the left's model so much as embracing the clearly better model on the right. So, you think about wealth redistribution. It's largely an impersonal force. Some money is taken out of your check in a way that you don't really see other than some text on a paycheck or whatever it is, right? And then someone else who you don't know distributes those resources to someone you don't know, don't have a voice in how they're distributed. I think, again, this is one of those areas where Christians can meet with a non-Christian and say, we live in a society that's clearly in a crisis of sympathy and empathy.
100%.
We're just not a neighborly people in a way that even historically a couple generations ago we were. Well, what system cultivates that? It's not this nameless, faceless redistribution of resources. The Christian ethic towards your neighbor boils down to love your neighbor as yourself. And so the idea is, when I think about the second greatest commandment in my faith, I am required to put myself in the person's shoes that I'm encountering. I'm required to try to see their view of the world. Then when you get to models that we have in the New Testament, like the Good Samaritan, who's the good Samaritan caring for? He's caring for someone that he's in proximity to, someone that he sees their wounds, he sees what their needs are. And then in proximity, he makes use of resources to provide for them. He takes them to the local end. He gives of his disposable income to make sure they're cared for. It's the more human way of doing these things. It's not just the more, and I guess I would say it's not just the more human way of doing these things. It's the more human way of cultivating these things. I am required to try to see it from my neighbor's perspective, even if I say, well, I don't think they're drawing the conclusions they should be. Nonetheless, I'm required to take that step. The model on the left doesn't require that at all. It requires basically nothing, and it doesn't do anything to cultivate actual connection to other human beings that I'm trying to help.
Yeah. What would you say if someone said, "Hey, Jeff, I think it's a little bit selfish. We're getting a bit more, I guess, specifically political on a political issue. Jeff, I think it's a little bit selfish that, you don't want to pay instead of, let's say you had a 10% tax, that you're not okay with that upping to 13% in order for us to have a better X, Y, and Z fund for welfare, whatever it is." If someone were to say, "Jeff, I think that's selfish," what was your response be to that?
Yeah, I would just inquire about what's more selfish. Is it more selfish for me to want my own resources to distribute according to the dictates of my faith, or to divert some of them to support a bureaucracy that I have no interest in supporting, and which will divert resources away from the people I want to help? It's not more selfish to want to be more efficient. That's where I started with. I think even the lost person can say, if we're really thinking about the lost persons, someone who's self-consciously not a Christian, if we're really wanting to make a real world impact, is bureaucracy the way to do it? And bureaucracy is inherently selfish. Somebody out there, a story that I think is going around, there were showers set up, and FEMA came in and stopped people from taking showers because they required anyone in those showers to have flip-flops. So there's some human being somewhere on earth right now with us who stopped people in a mudslide
Yeah.
from getting a shower because they didn't have flip-flops.
Yeah.
What kind of force can so warp and degrade a human being that you would actually intervene to say you cannot take a shower because you don't have flip-flops? Well, lostness, animosity towards your creator and his image bearers, Darwinian ways of thinking about the world and materialist ways of thinking about the world that degrade your sense that that this human being has dignity, and a bureaucracy that has taught you and catechized you and insisted that you believe the policy manual is the word of God and must be obeyed at all costs. It's unreal, man. But those are the forces we're talking about that shape the kind of conversation we're having, and the fruit of it couldn't be more clear. You're watching Smeagol become Gollum in those situations, because the bureaucracy, the policy manual, the procedures is something like a ring, and it calls out the worst within humanity.
Yeah. Interesting. And again, I don't know that specific North Carolina somewhere, I don't know. But that scenario, I don't know if it was created just for this disaster, if there's a general policy, I don't know. Probably
Sure.
In general, my guess was probably meaning well. Maybe in an office somewhere. But when you're on the ground, it's like, okay, we've got to acknowledge that this doesn't. We can embrace the exception this time.
Right. In charity, I want to say, like, somebody decided that was best practices, and it may be best practices. I mean, you're going to prevent the spread of foot fungus or something. I'll give you best practices, man. But surely to goodness, we should have the ability to discern between best practices in a controlled environment and real world need.
Yeah.
What force is powerful enough to get in the way of that? bureaucracy, you know.
Yeah, yeah. Well, you seem like a guy, Jeff, who loves red tape. You really seem like a guy who you love your systems. You love having to go through 12 different people to talk to the one that you want to talk to.
Yeah,
Um,
very much so.
one of your great joys in life.
Yeah, and I wanna own that the best version of those things is helpful accountability. So I'm not anti accountability,
Mhm.
but I am, to kind of borrow a catchphrase, I'm against toxic accountability that
Mhm.
metastasizes into something other than accountability
Mhm.
and becomes kind of honoring the form rather than what the form was created to do. I I do hate that stuff. But again, I think there are people out there whose giftedness is thinking about systems. They're thinking about
100%.
um, looking for the dangers down the roads. I don't want to live with an insurance adjuster, but I appreciate that they're there thinking about risk. I really
True.
do appreciate that. But there has to be an accountability for the accountability mechanism, and kind of a real world scenario should be one of the ways to do that. But you consistently see in those bureaucratic environments, they're untethered, they're unchecked. They get to become a mechanism where the point is the mechanism rather than whatever it was originally created to do, and that's where you're in real danger. That
Sure.
happens in charitable organizations, but there's much more real world accountability for those charitable organizations than they are these unchecked bureaucracies.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. I think you see some of that too, any I guess any organization, whether it be government, this or that, like a thing gets larger. And after a while, you get this system where it's like, a person who's in this position, they just want to make the one above them pleased so they're not axed or whatever. And that person
Mhm.
just doesn't want to get butt axed. And so it just becomes this kind of man mentality. And there's critical thinking ends up going because like whatever the top person says, yes, absolutely, let's do it. And that just
Whatever,
disseminated all the way down.
right?
So
Whatever keeps us in our job, right? And I mean, I get it. I don't want to be fired. The people I'm accountable to, I want to honor and keep things, relationally well lubed, where those relationships are working well. But that's not the case in government wealth redistribution. It's just not. I mean,
yeah,
empirically, there's not a counter argument.
true. Yeah, we waste a lot of money and we're not very efficient and we've had a deficit for the entirety of my lifetime. So
Yeah,
with seemingly no real desire to actually change things at all. Um,
sure, sure,
are we
and
talking
no,
about
and no,
spending this many trillions or slightly less this many trillions? We're never gonna, catch
and
up.
no mechanism to say we've attained, right?
Yeah,
Like we don't have a model for like we've gotten them on their feet. They're now
that is true.
self-productive, or there's no measurable. I mean, think about the empty pit that Ukraine has become. At what point do we know we've sent enough aid to Ukraine
Yeah.
or wherever else? We don't have those things. When you're working with a limited budget cultivated from donors and their charitable choices, you have to have those kind of things. And again, this is where I'm policy positive. You have to have these kind of measurables to say we've done what can reasonably be done. We've done all that can be done. We've done enough to get them to a place of self-sufficiency. We're not going to do more because we've attained those marks. Again, they just don't exist on that side of the aisle.
Yeah, yeah, that's a good point. When is enough, and how do we draw the line of we've done what is reasonable, and it would be unreasonable to keep going because now we are hurting those who we're taxing, for example. We're diluting, our ability here.
Well,
It's
again, that's baked
interesting.
into the New Testament as well, where Paul says if a man won't work, he shouldn't eat. And
Yeah,
so it's not if he can't work. We have lots of, things like you've already
true.
mentioned, the widow, who in that time just really had no economic ability whatsoever. It isn't if a man can't work. A man who can't work is cared for,
Yeah,
but a man who won't work shouldn't eat, and that's not, that's not imposed upon him by that command. That's a self-reflective command. If I'm someone who's lazy, I should not expect to eat.
mm,
Those things are built into the system too, so there has to be accountabilities and there has to be self-responsibility.
yeah, absolutely. So, left, left versus right, talking general categories, thinking of things like justice, mercy, charity, being humanitarian, these concepts, which we need to define biblically, but are still talked about at large in our society. In general, I believe, which is kind of my opening thought, I believe that the left has they've won the conversation on winning the public to who they kind of think is the party or the system that cares more for a lot of people, at least. I see through it, but yeah, go ahead.
Well,
Sorry.
the one thing I do want to interject there, they control the media institutions.
Yep.
And so they have definitely won the broadcasting apparatus. But I still think there's a kind of practicality to this. When the chips are down and somebody needs some help, I'm not sure they're really thinking that their best hope of getting help is going to be found standing in the equivalent of the DMV line at some government office. There are too many people who show up at my church door in either real need or fake need. It's not always easy to tell.
Yeah.
But when they're saying the chips are down, they're going to the church because they know that's a much better way to say I could actually get a meal right now when I'm hungry, rather than signing up for some kind of program that I'm going to be approved for, but the benefits will come in 90 days or whatever. Their promises are. So the cultural narrative through the broadcast apparatus probably is lost, but chips are down. I'm not entirely sure that people are actually hurting. Again, foxhole kind of hurt. I'm not sure they're going to what the broadcast would say.
Yeah. I mean, you definitely, the church is called out. In general, the church is called out for a lot of hypocrisy. Sometimes rightly so. Sometimes not. But the opposite is true as well. The church is called a lot of times evil, bigoted, stingy, this or that. But it's like, well, yeah, that one church that you hate, they do have that soup kitchen every Saturday at 6 a.m. And then the people that will get the soup and people that are in the neighborhood, they'll still post about how awful that church is 2 days later on Facebook. There's some hypocrisy.
Maybe. But they know where to get the food, right?
Yeah.
And I mean, I'll just ask you, if the chips are truly down for you, do you think you got a better chance of getting a sandwich from a pastor or a deacon versus the guy who's running your local health department? Now, which one's more likely to say, you know what I'll do? I'll hop out of what I was doing today and take time to make sure you've got a full belly in a way that keeps you alive.
True.
I don't think at that level, I don't think there's many people choosing the bureaucrat.
Yeah, that's true. Because there's probably a regulation too where he's actually not allowed to give it because he could be sued or something. I don't know.
Absolutely right. I mean, we're laughing about that, but that's probably true. There probably is some kind of like, you're stepping around the apparatus in a way that threatens our insurance policy, and so you can't do this.
Yeah,
and that's why they show up knocking at the church door.
So that media, we'll say more media, large scale institution narrative is overall caring for the poor, caring for those who were not started in a great place or whatever. Left kind of gets that. It's interesting to think about the fact that what we're told is that the party that is all about child sacrifice, all about denying what man and woman is, all about destroying the actual institution of marriage, which leads to sound families, which then leads to people leading flourishing lives, all these sorts of things. The party that has figured it out when it comes to compassion. That is such a crazy, but yet I'm telling you, I think some even Christians fall into it because it's been so shoved. Like we've got the the people that, yeah, they get some social issues right over here, but they're actually totally selfish and don't care about the poor. And then over here you have people, oh, they like that, yeah, they're terrible when it comes to sex, marriage, family, terrible this or that, but they care about the least of these. Yeah, any thoughts there?
I mean, just that what you led with can be layered on. It's not just children they want to kill on the front end of life. They're euthanizing old people. I mean, you name a historical category of vulnerable people.
Yep.
The left is after them. They want to kill them off because they're useless eaters. They're not productive, and so they want them gone. Who is going to adopt prostitute babies? It's Christians.
Yeah,
that's who it is. And we're not warehousing them in an orphanage. We try to get them in homes. And again, I think the easy canard for someone who's critical of the church is to say, well, there's abuse in some of those homes. You're right. There sure is. Have you seen the government school data on sex abuse? Have you seen government-run orphanage abuse statistics? Mm. Of course, there is some on the side of the church. Our worst day, we're not 3% of what the government's doing every day. Mm. So, if you decide evil people are going to do evil things, what's the mechanism for mitigating and reducing that? It's our home field. We have such an advantage statistically. It's not even a conversation.
Yeah. You speak about that, and you might have read through these kind of stats. I had one stat. This is not necessarily church related, but it's more politically associated. But I was blown away by this. I'm going to kind of give you a synopsis, because it goes in line with what we've been talking about. And this was from seemingly a reputable website. Philanthropyroundtable.org. Philanthropyroundtable.org. You might have seen it. So the one that I'm looking at, which is incredible, again, a little dated, but this was data from the 2012 presidential election. So still fairly recent history. And I don't know all the metrics of what went into it, but basically the overall graph is by state, the amount of the population in that state that is known for charitable giving. And it was broken down by 50 states, and one shade of states was lighter, the Republican, one is darker, Democrat in the 2012 race. And the top 15 states, I suppose, of charitable giving, all Republican. The bottom 15, 13 of them were Democrat. And, you fill the rest in with, I guess, mostly Democrat. But like the top 15 states in that 2012, election, which were, pretty much voting against the candidate at the time, which would have championed himself as the saint of the poor. This, where the rubber met the road, it's like, actually, no, it's a lifestyle. It's like you said earlier, it's this personal direct model, or, personal or familial direct to like an organization, that we can have more understanding of what they do rather than this redistribution system. I don't know if you caught any more statistics on that website, but I found that one really fascinating because it was recent, enough history to where I'm sure those trends would not have changed all that much.
Sure.
And it's
or if they've changed proportionately, right? Like the same people are doing it whatever level they're currently at. I mean, again, I referenced this earlier, but even people on the left have to come up with coping rhetoric to deal with this stuff where they're like, well, they're giving much more than we are, but they're probably not giving to gender reassignment surgery clinics, and you're like,
oh yeah, terrible.
Yeah, we're definitely not donating to child mutilation. Just really locked in on hunger, man.
Exactly. Yeah, gosh, compassion.
How awful.
Child mutilation. Yeah. Oh man, right. How are you not that compassionate?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. No, that one was. I'll probably link that article in the video here, because that was honestly astounding. And reading the statistics on this one were, I would kind of argue there's states that, maybe this is just my experience, but they're kind of states that growing up I was taught I'm supposed to kind of look down on. Um, and I'm talking, well, except for the first one, this is kind of funny. To our shame, maybe Utah, number one.
Mm,
Um,
sure.
the high Mormon population. But then you get 2 through like 7, Mississippi, Alabama, Tennessee, Georgia, South Carolina. Then you get Idaho, Oklahoma. Do 5 of those states have running water? Like, growing up, that's kind of like the
Exactly.
stuff that you'd hear. You're kind of supposed to hate the South and think everyone's racist and hates everyone. Yet,
Yeah, man, it's
rub me through.
effective rhetorical manipulation, and again, it comes from every institution in our culture. Um, but I know which one people are moving to.
Yeah, yeah, that's true. Hmm. Well, yeah, I don't know if I have too much else with this one. I just found it a fascinating topic. Conservatives, liberals, generosity. It's 2 different philosophies, too. And I think part of it goes to view of government. I did want to get your thoughts on this. So if someone, asks me like, well, why are you against, having an ever increasing welfare state, or why do you not want your taxes to go up here, or whatever? It's like, well, because I truly don't believe that primarily this is what God has designed the government for. He has designed civil servants for the general welfare of its people, but that takes the form of primarily keeping crime down,
Hmm.
punishing those who have done objective civil evils against their neighbor. It would assume certain things like obviously a form of that would be like a police force. A form of that is going to be some kind of idea of where the nation state ends and begins, aka
Hmm.
a border should exist, is
Borders,
the
right?
idea.
Hmm.
And so while there should be probably something in place for disasters like this, or for those that are just in a terrible circumstance, and maybe we can talk through that, primarily that's not what the government is for. And so I don't want to go against that model. Any thoughts there? Maybe I'm missing something.
No, I
But I
mean, I'm
believe
with
that your
you.
model of personal charity is just what the Bible tells me to do. And so I don't have the leeway to just say, well, no, I'll just farm it to the government.
Right. And I mean, I would throw back to our conversation earlier about built in limitations. Right. A government that sees itself as absolute has no check in the most Orwellian sense in pushing itself into every component of human life. Uh, we've talked about this, I think, in previous episodes. But when you kind of plug your ears and scream, "There is no God, there is no God," it's not like the category of God goes away. Something else just moves up to fill it.
Yeah.
And throughout human history, it's been government. It's been government. Even again, critics of the church, you can tell the church and the government is either constantly at war or trying to subvert the other
Yeah.
because they compete for the highest domain in human life. Um, Christians have a theology of limiting government. Government,
Yeah.
what you just said, is pretty broad. I have probably a much more limited view of limited government in terms of what I want the government to do. But at least we have the category of the government is commissioned to do certain things and not other things.
Sure.
So, Paul tells us that they're to restrain evil. Peter tells us they're to restrain evil and encourage good. I actually think that those two mesh up by saying by restraining evil, you give, it's like weeding a field. By restraining evil, you give profitable things room to grow. And
Sure.
because we're made in the image of God and he's operative in his creation, they're going to. But we have a category for it. That's really not the government's job. The government doesn't have a category for that if it's self-consciously secular. It
Mhm.
thinks it is God. And so so many people who find themselves on the right now came there because leftism through the government went radically beyond where they thought was an appropriate boundary. You're constantly seeing people who are like, I guess I'm on the right now.
Yeah.
Elon Musk would be an example of that, right?
Yeah.
It's because there's no check on what the government can impose itself upon.
Mm.
The government wants to have a monopoly on violence. We're the ones who can impose our will with force. The right, particularly the right that's undergirded by Christian theology, says actually there's some things the government isn't authorized to do, and it
Yeah.
shouldn't do it. And that's a helpful check that is cast aside in a materialist framework.
Yeah. No, that's a great point. I mean, you saw these things come out to bear during COVID.
Absolutely.
Like the government, what did the government become? And they can become a lot of things, but it's like they're just shoving masks and needles in people.
Right. And they rhetorically
It's like
pivot on
not
the
your
principles.
jurisdiction.
Right. Your body, your choice went out the window when it came to
Yeah.
COVID.
Yeah.
And again, because the principle isn't so much what they say the principle is, right? Like, bodily autonomy. The principle is we get to tell you what's best.
Yeah.
And so anything that is downstream from that can be changed on its head, on a dime, because ultimately the real principle is we know what's best. We're here to impose it upon you if need be, and we'll do so.
And
You
again,
can't even rely on what their messaging is going to be.
not at all. Veneer of compassion, right?
Yeah.
You better wear the mask or you're killing everyone.
Right.
I think maybe I don't know if it was you and I, but like false dichotomies everywhere. Like that's one of them.
Yeah.
Wear a mask or you hate your grandma eternally. Oh, good.
Right. And so learn, instead of loving your neighbor as yourself, learn to love your neighbor as a potential enemy who's going to kill you. Again, think about what's cultivating human sympathy and empathy. I'm a guy who thinks empathy really is a danger as a concept. I think Rigney's right on that. I don't think it's a useless concept,
Mm-hmm.
but whose actual operations are encouraging the kind of things that we all realize we're in desperate need of, like empathy? The person who's thinking, hey, how do I get in my neighbor's shoes to try to understand it from their side so I can love them well? Or the person who's saying they may sneeze and kill you, and so you better keep at least 6 feet of distance between yourselves.
Yeah. Yeah. Terrible. Well, yeah, man, I do appreciate it. Thanks for all your thoughts, your time, everything like this. I hope for those who get to watch this that it's helpful. We got a lot going on right now. Election coming up, a hurricane, and so I am thankful that when we have these kind of conversations, we have a secure hope that we're grounding things in, because so much happens in just like a year that
No
it's
kid,
enough to drive a person
in a
crazy.
month.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, in a month. Who's talking about Trump being
Last time we talked, it was right after
you
he got shot. You never know.
Feels like 100 years ago. Yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
John, it's always a pleasure to be on. I'm always honored when you ask. Thanks for the chance, and thanks for a good conversation. I would do this without it recording, so I'm appreciative of each chance we get to do it.
Absolutely. I will. This is not a prank. I am recording, so that'd be a fun conversation. All this was under the pretense of recording, but yeah, man, really enjoyed it, and of course, would love to have you on again sometime.
Anytime. Say the word.
Thanks, man.